My name is Tammy Medlin, and I'm the local history librarian here at the Wilson County Public Library. And I'd like to welcome you to this month's program, What's New in Local History. We just wanted to show you some of the new books we've added to our collection and some of the old ones we've rediscovered. One of the ones we're most proud of is this is the Vic Genealogy, 2 volumes. And it's the Vic Genealogy, the study of a Southern American family in white and black. In other words, white descendants and slave descendants. Actually, the smaller one is volume 1, and it is descendants of, let's see, open it up here. Volume 1, descendants of Joseph Vick of Virginia, generations 1 through 4. And volume 2 is generations 5 through 7. Now, why is volume 2 thicker? Well, volume 2 has the index, and you have to understand the further down you go, the more generations, the more people there are to track. And one reason we're particularly interested in this book is if you turn to page 860, 861, and that's those volumes together have that many pages. We have information on the father of, we have Daniel Vick and one of his sons, Samuel Hines Vick, who is very well known here in Wilson. So we have information on this family, and sometimes it will even give information. It will detail how they track down the information on this particular individual. So it's a 2-volume set, and it is here in local history. Stop by and take a look at it. Another new book we have is The Country Doctor Museum, Early Medical Practices, Treatments, and Medicines by James A. Bailey and Margaret Bailey, who actually live in Bailey in Nash County. And it talks about the Country Doctor Museum that's there, but it also gives a lot of information about how the museum how the museum itself and how artifacts in the museum relate to the medical practices of the time. Now, everybody talks about doctors used to make house calls. Well, those doctors didn't always have cars. They had buggies, they had carriages, and they had early cars. And part of the local Country Doctor Museum is the carriage house. And you can see they have some of the carriages and different types of conveyances doctors would use to get around. And my particular favorite, just because I love the name, is this is a 1912 Ford Model T, and it's a Ford torpedo runabout. Sounds kind of like we would say today if somebody had a Mustang, but this is a Ford torpedo runabout from 1912, owned by a country doctor. And if you can just imagine trying to get to someone who's in labor at night, down a country road, in a rainstorm, and by country road I mean dirt road, and be driving this. It sounds like it would be pretty easy to get stuck and very hard to get unstuck. So stop by the museum and take a look. If you're wondering why we have Nash County records, well, Wilson County was established in 1855, and when they made it, they took land from Nash, land from Edgecombe, land from Johnston, and land from Wayne County to make Wilson County. So we do have a pretty good sized collection on those counties. And of course, this is not very far down the road. It's about 11 or 12 miles. So this is like a local tourist stop or something you'd be interested in if you're interested in history of the area and the history of medicine. James and Margaret have also done another book, and it is on the Sandy Level Cemetery burial records. This book was done in 2023. The church was near Bailey, but the church is not there anymore, but the cemetery still is. And the burials in the cemetery date all the way from 1904 to 1995. There's over 154 burials. Over 30 of those burials date to the 19th century. Were from people born in the 19th century, buried in the 20th century, but born in the 19th century, the 1800s. And the way this book is set up, and it was an African-American church, is part 1 has the obituaries and the death records of the individuals they found that were buried there. And part 2 has the actual death certificates. So the way you would use this is you would open it up, and on page 5 we have the obituary of George Baker. And George was born December 31st, 1905, died August 26, 1972. And it says funeral services for George Baker, who died Saturday in Wilson Memorial Hospital, so we have our local tie-in, will be held Thursday at 2 p.m. at the First Baptist Church with Reverend Eddie Woodard officiating. Burial follow in Sandy Level Cemetery. Survivors include his wife, Miss Florida Baker, 6 daughters, it names the daughters, 4 sons, it names the sons, and then it also tells you, that it was at Edwards Funeral Home, and they would receive people from 8 to 10 p.m., and it was in the Wilson Daily Times on August 29th, 1972, and it tells you that they do have the death certificate. Now, in some places, they don't. So we're going to turn over to the death certificates, and we are looking for George Baker. And this is a copy of his death certificate. I chose his because it is filled out in typewritten information, so it's a little bit easier to read. And this is basically to show you why you would use a death certificate in genealogy. It gives you his name, race, gender, date of birth, date of death, the age he was when he died, which was 66, that he died at Wilson Memorial Hospital, his wife's name, and it also gives you his father's name and his mother's maiden name. So if you're trying to trace a female and she's married and she's using her husband's name, sometimes it's trick for your female ancestors. It's hard to find their maiden name and trace their line. So a death certificate will give you, luckily, if you're lucky, your mother's maiden name. Now what it is they also have on here who gave the information. Now in this case, the information was given by Florida Baker, his wife. So if this person did not know who your father was or what your mother's maiden name was, I have seen death certificates that actually say unknown. Actually, and there's a stamp down here, and I'm glad it says this. It says Dudley B. Anderson, MD, Carolina General Clinic, Wilson. And the reason I'm glad they have that is if you see right here, doctors still had bad handwritings in 1972. I think it's required to get your MD these days, is that you cannot read the signature. The last book we're going to talk about by Jim and Margaret is Town of Bailey, Cemetery Deeds, 1943 to 2010. It's 2 parts. The first part's date from like 1943 to 1960. The second part is the first part is 1960 to 2010, and the second part is 1943 to 1960. And these are actually the deeds from the cemetery, and what they do is this is where they show who bought the lot. So this is not an actual list of who's buried in the Baileytown Cemetery. This is a list of who bought the lots in the cemetery. Well, why would you want that? Well, basically you had different size lots. You could have a 5 by 10, which would hold 1 person. You could have a 10 by 10 lot, which would have 2 people buried there. You could have a bigger lot for 4, up to 6, 8, or more. Well, what does that tell you? Well, that tells you the people who are buried in that lot are probably related in some way to the person who bought the deed. It could be the parent dies, the adult child buys a lot, he leaves space in it for his, let's say the father passes away, the oldest son buys a lot, has space for his father, space for his mother, space for him and his wife, and if they have an unmarried brother or sister, leave space for her. You may have somebody with a different last name that could be an in-law, or a grandchild be buried there generations later, who's the child of a married daughter. But it basically tells you that the people who are buried in that lot are connected in some way to this person. So, and Nash County is next door. So this is a new book we're glad to get, and it was published in 2023. Now, one book that is unique to Wilson is Greater Freedom, The Evolution of the Civil Rights Struggle in Wilson, North Carolina, and it's by Charles W. McKinney, Jr. And there's not a lot of pictures in this volume. I'll show you the title page. and it came out in 2010. And it's going to give you a lot of stories you're not going to read about in a North Carolina history textbook because it is specific to Wilson County. And one of the earliest stories in here is the story of Marie Everett, who in 1945, just after the end of World War II, she was, some say 16, some say 14 years old, and she was African American. She went with a friend of hers to the Carolina Theater, and they went, during the movie, they went to get popcorn, and there was words between Marie and the cashier, and when she left, Marie stuck out her tongue. She is a teenager at the cashier, and the cashier apparently slapped her and tried to choke her, and Marie kicked the cashier. Well, they called the police, and actually the one who got arrested was Marie because she kicked the cashier. Didn't do anything to the cashier because she was trying to choke Marie. And she was charged with simple assault. Well, then she gets to the court the next morning or the next time she's in court, and her charges have been upgraded from disorderly conduct to, as I said, simple assault, which is supposed to be a misdemeanor. And when it actually goes to court, the maximum she's supposed to get for that is a fine and 30 days in jail. But this is a young lady, 14 to 16 years old, and the judge, for some reason nobody can comprehend, gets rid of the fine but makes her sentence 6 months in jail, and he's not only going to put her in jail, he's going to send her to their version of the state women's prison in Raleigh. Well, the problem with that was Marie was a minor. She was not supposed to be in the prison, so they send her up to Raleigh. She's too young. They send her up to Raleigh. The people at the prison take one look at her and send her back to jail in Wilson. They're like, she's a minor. We cannot put her in here. Word got out of what was going on, thanks to the local NAACP and some other organizations and papers, and word got out, and there was an outcry, and she went into prison in February. She came out in March, and she was basically paroled by the governor, and they said it was to continue her education, that they were letting her out so she could go back to school. At this point, she had missed 5 months. But that was, you think of the Civil Rights era, this is 20 years before the Civil Rights era. This is 1945. So you're predating the Civil Rights era by about 20 years. And her name was Marie Everett. Another one we have specific to Wilson is Historic Wilson in Postcards. I did not really ever think about Wilson being on a postcard, but it is. And this is by J. Robert Borkin III, who is a member of our Wilson County Genealogical Society. He's also done some other books here in Wilson. This is not a new book, but it's one people really don't think of because you don't think of it being history being told by postcards. Well, they are. And he's got it divided into sections. You have a section of downtown scenes, public buildings and banks, hospitals and hotels, schools and churches, residential areas, agriculture and industrial, and then around town. So if we come to, this one is one. These are all different versions, all different views of Tarbar Street. Everybody knows Tarbar Street here in Wilson. It's a pretty good long street. But this is views of different buildings and time periods on Tarbar Street. There's also a postcard here that shows the Woolworths building. We had a Woolworths 5 and dimes. Why would I be interested in that? Well, at one point, the Wilson County Library, before this building was built, was located in the Woolworths building. That would be like our library being next to the Walmart. And then later on it was moved to the courthouse, and then of course this building was built in 1939. So you will find information in here, and you will find pictures in here on the postcards that you will not find anywhere else. So it's a good way to look at Wilson, especially downtown Wilson, through time. Now this is the one we have just discovered, and I'm very glad we did. If you look at this, this says Marriage Register of Wilson County. And you're thinking, this is kind of thin to be a record of marriages. Well, these are not, this is not a normal marriage register, and I did not know that until I opened the title page, and it says Marriage Register are certificates to freed men and women of Wilson County, North Carolina. Introduction by Hugh Buckner Johnson, and alphabetized by Ruth Johnston Davis. What it is, the African Americans were freed in 1865. They had been married during slavery. Marriages were not recognized by the county or the state, but they considered themselves to be married. A lot of them had gone through a religious service. So what a lot of counties did, a lot of states did, is a time was appointed just after the Civil War, where these people could go to the courthouse and get their marriages recorded, so there could be a public record and they could be acknowledged and could be recognized. Now in Wilson, that was done in the summer of 1866, and what this gives you is it gives you the husband or the wife's name, the spouse's name, and the date. But what's important is right here, how long they had been married when the marriage was registered. If the marriage was registered in 1866, how long were they married before that? I started looking through here, and I found Reuben Dew and Nancy Farmer. When the marriage was recognized on August 25th, 1866, they had already been together 52 years. So that means you have just taken this family all the way back to 1814. A lot of people, African American genealogy, they hit the 1870 census, which is the first census the freed slaves would be listed in, and they hit a block. They call it the 1870 block. This is a way to get around the block. Because then what you could do is you could look at 1870 census, find some of these people who were not quite of that age, have been together 4 years, 3 years, 9 years, whatever, and maybe get a list of their children's names, and then come down from there. But you have gotten past the block, you have gone all the way back to 1814. And they actually called these cohabitation bonds. We had them on microfilm. I wanted to get them printed out, put them in a binder, and then I found out we already had these. But I wouldn't know it because all this said is Marriage Register of Wilson County, North Carolina. So these are some of the treasures, and I definitely consider this one to be a treasure that we have here in the local history room. And I invite everybody to come in and take a look at it. And I hope you've enjoyed this program, and please leave your comments below. Thank you for joining us.